This is going to be a beginning video to a series of videos that I'm going to call 8 Days of Hell. It was about Indian attacks on the Pennsylvania and Maryland frontier in late February and early March of 1756. And we are starting here actually in Maryland. I'm just outside of Hancock, Maryland, at the sign here for Fort Stoddard, or Stoddard's Fort. And I want to start with an introduction first. So I know we've covered some of this in other videos, but the beginning of the French and Indian War started with the attack at the Battle of Monongahela. General Braddock's army and the British response against the French moving into the Ohio Territory failed miserably at Braddock's defeat at the Battle of Monongahela, July 9th, 1755. And because of this, the British army was completely defeated. They slunk back to Fort Cumberland and eventually to the Cumberland Valley in central Pennsylvania today. And they vacated the frontier by going into winter quarters in Philadelphia. By vacating the frontier, there was nothing here to protect the locals from Indian attacks. So the people decided they were going to build frontier forts, or private forts for defense purposes. There was also provincial government involvement both in Maryland and Pennsylvania in helping with these forts. But then local militia actually attempted to fill in the gap of the defense of the frontier. Now, the French were beginning to pay the Indians to attack the frontier, and the idea of this was to eliminate material supplies that could support yet another attempt by the British to attack French forts in the Ohio country. They were trying to avoid another invasion like Braddock's. So they were paying Indians, and this also included the Delaware, because the Delaware were actually originally aligned with the English. They switched allegiances to the French with the idea that because the English were kind of screwing them out of land, and now the French were paying for these Indian attacks. So it was a win-win situation for them at the time. Now, late summer 1755, and then into November, you had native war parties attacking frontier settlements in the Great Cove, which is now present-day Fulton County, Pennsylvania. They destroyed approximately 30 farms, and 50 people were confirmed killed or captured, but that number could be a lot higher, maybe twice or three times that amount. We are unsure. This is the sign for Stoddard's Fort. It was a provincial fort started by Lieutenant Stoddard, and it filled in for the defense for the provincial forces of Maryland, the colony of Maryland at the time, to help protect its civilians. And it was used up until the creation of Fort Frederick, which was a larger and better equipped fort. But Stoddard's Fort actually stood over here, which I'm going to take you in a minute to show you exactly where, or roughly around where Stoddard's Fort actually sat. But this is the sign for it along US 144 in Maryland. So the location that I'm standing at right now is actually the location of Stoddard's Fort, or roughly in the area of it. It would be back here in these woods somewhere. And Stoddard's Fort is known also as Tonolaway, or the Fort Tonolaway, or Totonaway, or Canolaway, depending on how it was spelled or who was saying it. I've heard it spelt and said all different ways. And it was actually called that because of a local creek that ran here. It was the Tonolaway Creek, and then you had the Little Tonolaway Creek. And this area was actually called the Tonolaway Settlement. And Stoddard's Fort, or Fort Tonolaway, was designed with the idea of defending this settlement. Now, what they would do is a lot of times they would have a provincial fort, which that's what Stoddard's Fort was. It was the provincial fort for the provincial forces. And then nearby they will have another fort that would be where the local people would actually retreat to in case of an emergency. In this case, down here in the Tonolaway settlement, Stoddard's Fort was the provincial fort, and then Fort Coombes Coombes was the fort for the people to vacate their houses and go there for protection. Now, the Conocajig settlement, which we will see later in this series of videos, for the 8 days of hell. Will be featured later, and it had something similar. The provincial forces were at McDowell's Mill, or McDowell's Fort, and then the local people, for protection, would retreat to Fort Steele, or Reverend Steele's Fort, which was a church that they turned into a fortification for the benefit of the community. So that's the kind of pattern that they always followed, and that was both in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Now, on February the 25th, 1756 to February the 29th, 1756, this area was seeing heavy activity by attacks by Indians. The attacks were led by Delaware War Chief Shingus and Captain Jacobs. Now, I did a previous video on the attack of Fort McCord. Shingus was present there, and then the Battle of Sidling Hill had both Shingus and Captain Jacobs there. Now, that event occurred about a month after the events that we're talking about for the 8 days of hell. But they were all involved, and they were the main antagonists in these stories. Now, they were moving, these attacks from the war chiefs were actually moving further east into the Conagajig settlement. They started in this area, where they started in the Great Cove, then they moved into the Tonolaway settlement and up into the Little Cove, and then eventually into the Conagajig settlement further east. Now, in the Little Cove, they actually destroyed and burned a lot of property. Modern-day Warren Township in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, is what is known as the Little Cove. And according to the Maryland Gazette at the time, 3 people were killed and scalped in the Little Cove, 4 people were reported captured, and several barns were burnt, and a large number of livestock was killed. Now, an eyewitness to all this was a man named Isaac Baker. Now, Isaac Baker is actually from the Broad Fording area towards Hagerstown, Maryland. But he had a militia group that moved west into what is now modern-day Hancock, or what was back then called the Tonolaway settlement. And he moved in here with the idea that he was going to help take out the Indians and move them out of the area so they would not attack any more people. And he wrote an eyewitness account. Now, he was around this area on February the 27th of 1756. And his eyewitness account goes similar to this. So first thing that he did was, as he was moving towards the modern-day Hancock, Maryland, he found a John Myers' house in flames. 9 or 10 head of large cattle were killed, along with several of his calves, horses, and sheep, all done by the Indians. Then he moved on and found a Mr. Haynes, who was killed and scalped. He had one arm cut off and several arrows sticking in him. He then found Ralph Matson's house, and it was burned to the ground with several sheep and hogs killed. Then he moved on to Stoddard's Fort, which is where we are here at right now. Here is where he actually found the local militia, and he said everyone was under arms and waiting for an imminent attack by the Indians to occur here at this spot. Luckily, that attack never occurred. So I'm having technical difficulties with my GoPro camera, so I'm resorting to my phone now. So as I said, the show must go on, but let's see if I can do this. Anyway, I'm standing in downtown Hancock at the moment. This is Fort Coombes, or Fort Coombes, I think it's pronounced Fort Coombes, sign for Maryland. Now, Fort Coombes was actually a Maryland fort. It was, like I said, Stoddard's Fort was for the militia and provincial forces. Fort Coombes was where everybody went to. They needed to hide. The local people had to hide. They went to Fort Coombes. Now, we were continuing with Isaac Baker. If you remember, I said Isaac Baker was going through the area on the 27th of February, and he was seeing all these atrocities that were occurring. Well, after he made it back to Stoddard's Fort, after finding people mutilated and houses burnt and cattle killed and everything like that, he eventually made his way north to Fort Coombes. Now, Fort Coombes, from this spot here, it wasn't actually at this spot, it was actually north from here. And according to the sign, if you can read it, which it might be backwards unless I invert this picture, but anyway, the Fort Coombes was north of here, and it was right next to the Mason-Dixon line, or in the vicinity of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, because it was a Maryland fort, it was supposed to be in Maryland, but at the time, the Mason-Dixon line, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, was a little up in the air because they weren't quite sure where it was supposed to be at. So it turned out when they surveyed it in 1763, the line between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and finished the survey in 1767, Coombes Fort was actually in Pennsylvania, not by much. And the location I'll put up there for you so you have it, but we won't go see it today because it's not a very good place to actually get footage. But anyway, Isaac Baker went to Fort Coombes, and he describes the attack that he's seen the aftermath, but he describes the attack as it was told to him. So there was two boys, their last names was Lynn and Coombes, and while sitting on a fence around a fort, they spotted incoming Indians, of course, and they ran for the fort, but Lynn, he was shot dead by the Indians and later was scalped. Now Coombes, he made it to the fort, and he was able to shoot one of his assailants, the Indians chasing him about 30 feet from the fort, who the Indian was actually carrying a tomahawk. 4 men, and only 2 of them were able to bear arms, were at the fort, and there was over 40 women and children present and occupied the fort. The Indians tried to set the fort on fire, but it was extinguished with soapy water in tubs from the wash that day. So luckily the ladies of the fort saved the day with their laundry, of course. Now, after he visited Fort Coombes and seen the aftermath there, of course, he found the dead body of this Lynn. Isaac Baker found a load of oats and turnips on the road, and that load of oats and turnips actually was supposed to go to Fort Coombes, and it was led by 2 boys, but those 2 boys were long gone and missing, most likely captured by the Indians who attacked them. So here we are again, Indian atrocities. People were getting killed, animals were getting killed. They're trying to burn down houses. They killed some guy going to the fort. They captured these 2 boys. It's just a mess. Hence the reason why it's 8 days of hell. And this is, again, February the 27th when he was witnessing all this stuff. So as Isaac Baker moved on, he found more sheep and cattle killed at a farm. And he went to a place called Lawther's Farm. And it was in Maryland. His grain and 2 calves were burnt. He had 2 cows and 10 hogs killed. And then they came up on a body. Well, it turned out that was Lawther himself, the farmer. And he was dead, of course. He was also scalped. His brains were beaten out of him. He had an axe, 2 scythes, and several arrows sticking in him. Mutilated to a point where you probably couldn't even notice he was much of a man anymore. Later on, Isaac Baker took his militia that he was leading around and returned to Stoddard's fort, which is where we were just at, and that's where he spent the night of the 27th of February, 1756. And then I imagine they got up the next day and pursued the Indians even further if they could. But anyway, this is the sign from Fort Coombes, and the Fort Coombes site is just north of here across the Pennsylvania border. So this is me taking a lunch break outside of Sheetz with my lovely Sheetz food, contemplating what I'm going to do if the footage that I have spent all morning in the cold running around and about 60 miles worth of driving suddenly gets deleted off of my GoPro because it can't read my freaking SD card. So anyway, let's hope that it will work, as I do not want to have to repeat myself again. Greetings from Pectonville, Maryland. I am actually standing in a county park called Camp Harding. It is famous for not necessarily French and Indian War things. This was actually a location where President Harding and his fellow vagabonds would meet on occasion. And when I say vagabonds, I'm talking Firestone, Edison, and various other individuals that gathered in the early part of the 20th century and actually promoted the motor car. And one of them was being Henry Ford too. But while I'm here is actually still dealing with our 8 days of hell during the French and Indian War in 1756. Where I'm standing here is actually near the location of a fort owned by a Thomas Mills. Fort Mills is what this place was called. It was in this area somewhere. Now, Fort Mills was not built by the time we had the 8 Days of Hell in February and March of 1756. Actually, it was built that summer. But Thomas Mill did have a house here at the time. And Thomas Mill actually was never attacked by Indian raiding parties. This area is known as Indian Springs locally. Indian Springs, and it's very close to Clear Spring, and it's actually between Clear Spring and Hancock, Hancock being where we were just at. Now, the question is why did Thomas Mill's house and also the people who lived in Indian Springs not get attacked by Indians? Now, there was an instance where he was attacked by opportunists. They were actually white men who pretended to be Indians or whatever, and they were taking advantage of the terror with the idea that they could actually steal your stuff or make off with your cattle or things, basically to terrorize you. They were terrorists, and if they caught them, they probably would have hung them, because that's just freaking stupid. But Thomas Mill was only attacked by them and never by the Indians. And the question is why? And then even the whole area here, he was just one example, but you had people all over Indian Springs area and even up in the Blair's Valley, which is very close to Indian Springs, and nobody was attacked by Indians. And the question is, why did the Indians attack everything around this place, but never attacked here? The answer to the question of why the Indians didn't attack the Indian Spring area may lie just behind me, literally. Welcome to the Forsyth Family Cemetery, located in the now extinct town of Forsyth, or village of Forsyth. It's actually, I'm on Mermont Road, Clear Spring, Maryland, not all that far from the intersection with Hanging Rock Road. And here is a Forsyth family cemetery that has been in existence for over 250 years. And I'll take you on a walk around here to show you a little bit of the cemetery and what it looks like. But I'll give you a little bit of history on the family Forsyth. John Jacob Forsyth first settled here in the Indian Springs, Clear Spring area in 1732. He actually arrived here from France, interesting enough. And Forsyth, this John Jacob Forsyth, he actually befriended the Indian chief in the area, whose name, according to family history, is Wahashi. And this John Jacob Forsyth married that chief's daughter, who happened to be named Zula. At least that's what the family always said. Now, both Zula and this John Jacob Forsyth are buried just behind me in this cemetery. Now, I don't know exactly where. The stones are very old in this cemetery, which you will find out soon enough as I walk you through here for a little bit. But he's supposedly buried in here. The Indian chief transferred 3,000 acres of land to Forsyth in this Indian Spring area. And the deed was actually written on deerskin, which is, according to the family, actually existed up until probably the late part of the 20th century. Now, I'm not sure if they knew where it's at or not. And who knows, it might have been lost to history, we're not sure. But that was an agreement with the Indians here at the town of Forsyth. Now, 3,000 acres is a lot of property, and most likely encompassed a lot here, which he most likely sold off as parcels to various people. So, in Forsyth, also, his home would have been up here at the intersection, which again is between Mermont Road and Hanging Rock Road and Clear Spring, which is not all that far away from here, and that was where his house was. Now, Forsyth was a Frenchman, and he was married to an Indian chief's daughter. So, why would the Indians not attack Indian Spring area? Well, most likely because they knew that it was under the control of the Forsyth family, who were friendly to the Indians, who were married into the Indians, and also was French. And why would the French and Indian forces want to attack one of their own? So that is the only explanation that I have at the moment that would explain why the Indians would not have attacked the Indian Springs area during the 8 Days of Hell, and also all of the other attacks and atrocities that occurred in this general vicinity over the years following the 8 Days of Hell. As you can see, there are some modern stones going back 100 in 50 years ago in some cases. But most of them are actually these old stones. And I imagine the Forsyth family was relatively poor at one point or another, living back here. That's not the greatest farm ground in the world. But a lot of these stones that you see here are just field stones with no markings. So John Jacob and his wife Zula, who were the patriarch and the matriarch of this family in America, could be any one of these stones, and we don't really know. Now, I do not know if there is a record kept of who is who in this cemetery. I don't know. Maybe something that we can find at a later date. But just wanted to give you an overview of the family cemetery here. Luckily, somebody is mowing it. So now I'm in the intersection of Furnace Road and Fort Davis Road, located in the Little Cove, which is Warren Township, Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And in our series of 8 Days of Hell, on February the 29th, the Indians found their way out of the Tonolaway settlement and came up through this section of the Little Cove. They already devastated the southern part of the Little Cove in Maryland and destroyed pretty much all the houses and captured or killed a lot of people and killed a lot of livestock. But then they moved further north up into the Little Cove here to what is Fort David Davis. Now, Fort David Davis would have set either somewhere behind me over here, which is now owned by the state, or it would have set over in here somewhere. There's a little bit of discrepancy on exactly where Fort David Davis set, but I think the majority of historians believe it was over here where the state owns the property. Just down the road here is actually the trailhead for the Tuscarora Trail here in Warren Township. But anyway, at this intersection, like I said, it was set Fort David Davis. It was a private fort owned by a man named David Davis, and he fortified his own home in order to protect the people of his family and the surrounding families that lived here in the Little Cove at the time. Now, at noon on February the 29th, 1756, 2 boys were fired on by 3 Indians. One boy made it to warn Fort David Davis of the incoming attack. The other boy was killed. Now, if you notice a pattern here, the same thing happened at Coombes Fort, where he had 2 lads outside, and one makes it to the fort and the other one doesn't. And they wind up warning the fort. Now, the Indians, there was a barn outside of the house where Fort David Davis was. The barn was actually taken over by the attacking Indians. They took possession of the barn and then opened fire onto the fort itself, the house. And there were about 8 to 10 men inside the fort, and also several women and children as well. Now, there was a William James. William James was actually the father-in-law of David Davis. And while climbing a ladder to the loft, he was actually shot by the Indians and killed. And when his body fell, David Davis caught him. But the women seen the old man fall, and they screamed and shrieked in terror. But anyway, David Davis drew his sword and pointed it at these women and said, "Hush, or I will run you through with this sword." So he was afraid that if the Indians heard the women scream, that the Indians would press their attack, knowing that they had an advantage. And so he was trying to hush them up and threatened to run them through with his sword. That is the tradition of the story of what happened here at Fort David Davis. According to the report, several Indians were killed. The Indians burnt the barn down with their dead in it, along with possibly dead from Coombes Fort and other places in which they suffered casualties. And then the Indians split up into 2 groups, and then they left the vicinity and retreated. Now, the Indians would practice this covering up of their own dead because they didn't want to show their numbers, one, and they also didn't want to leave behind any evidence that the whites were being successful. They were trying to terrorize them, so they didn't want to give them an idea that they were actually defeating the Indians in some way, shape, or form. Well, after the attack here at Fort David Davis, Peters Township was warned. Now, Peters Township is on the other side of the mountain here, and it is located in what is now Peters Township today of Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Now back then Franklin was part of Cumberland County, so it was all Cumberland County. So it was Peters Township of Cumberland County 250 years ago in 1756. But Peters Township was warned. Now the head of Peters Township, when it came to the military and the militia, was Fort McDowell, or McDowell's Mill, which is located in the current village of Marks, Pennsylvania, just outside of Mercersburg. Now they sent word that David Davis was attacked, that Indians were here in a little cove, and they were terrorizing the area. And so Fort McDowell sent several small parties of men to the little cove to relieve Fort David Davis. In the morning, there's 46 men set off in pursuit for the Indians. They found 6 Indians which abandoned their horses, and they also found a woman who was taken prisoner and escaped the clutches of the Indians. Another group of militia under the command of Sheriff Potter. Now, Sheriff Potter was in charge, or he was the sheriff of Cumberland County at the time, and he followed a group of Indians until evening, when the snow fell so quickly and heavy and thick, that he had to return to Fort David Davis and bunk there for the night. Now, keep in mind that by doing this, by McDowell relieving or taking their men and bringing them over here to chase down Indians, now they're leaving Fort McDowell open for an attack, which plays a pivotal role in the coming day. This is February 29th, in which the Indians will press their attack further east into what is known as the Cumberland Valley, or the Conacajig settlement at the time, and press their attack onto the provincial forces of Fort McDowell.